Thank you, Sergey, for the invitation. I'm really ecstatic to be here. It's been a really fantastic morning, lots of stimulating ideas, and I'm actually really excited about the rest of the meetings that are happening tomorrow. So hopefully we'll have plenty more time to discuss some of the stuff that I'm doing here and other stuff that I've been doing at my lab. But I want to start the whole talk by actually coming clean. Like Sergey already told you about that, I'm not an anthropologist. I am not a person that is a specialist in agriculture. I'm an evolutionary ecologist by training and by heart. And I have to acknowledge before I do anything that nothing that I'm doing here could be done without the amazing work of people who have actually gone to the field to measure all these traits in culture and to educate me about the importance of these things for our own species and the nuances that we need to consider in this kind of work. So I want to start by acknowledging that I approach this topic humbly and with the idea that I might be able to contribute some, but that I don't have the definite answers. And in that light, I want to tell you how it all began. And I want to start by saying that I was a member of what used to be called the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, another synthesis center for people who are younger, people here in the audience. There used to be a time in which evolutionary biology had a place like Nimbus. And it was an amazing period of time. And I was part of a working group that was trying to, well, I was a postdoc there, and I was part of several different working groups. But one of the working groups that we were developing was trying to understand the diversity of human languages, the evolution of diversity in human languages, and how we could apply ecological and evolutionary tools to try to understand it. In doing so, we realized that we could actually do much more than that by combining the phylogenies that we could create out of language, the cultural phylogeny that we could create there with actual data on the traits that human societies at the tips of those phylogenies had. And that for me was a humongous realization of the kinds of things that I could see, because I immediately started seeing that a lot of the questions that I had been pursuing as a biologist could actually be translated almost naively, I have to say, directly into this context. And then I thought like, oh, maybe I could do something here. And one of the first things that I did was actually start exploring patterns. And this is one of the things that really struck my eyes the first time. And what I'm showing you here is just basically the distribution of a specific kind of religious beliefs. If you go and ask people in different parts of the world whether they believe that there is some sort of deity that would punish them if they do something that is morally wrong, you find that some people say yes and some people say no. In this particular case, the blues are the yes and the reds are the no's. And the reason why this particular map or distribution of red and blue dots was so exciting to me was because at that point I had been working for several years on the evolution of sociality in birds. And as soon as I saw this graph, I immediately said, holy crap, and excuse my language, but this is almost identical to the distribution of cooperative breeding in birds. What the hell? Why is it so close? And we're talking about so completely different things, religious beliefs and cooperation in birds. And then I started thinking, could there be some sort of link between the processes that we think that operate in birds and the things that are happening at a cultural level in our own species? So I went to talk to somebody, to a religious scholar, and ask him the question, is there any evidence that religious beliefs somehow are engaged or could be related to sociality or to the way that groups function? And he said, of course, Carlos, there's actually experimental evidence showing that if you remind people of shared religious beliefs, they tend to avoid cheating, they cooperate more, they follow rules a little bit better, they actually are more productive. Those kinds of things we know experimentally that happened just by reminding them of a shared religious belief. So there could be some idea, there's actually a lot of theory that suggests that maybe some aspects of our religious behavior could be related with these ideas of like group functioning. And again, this is one distinction that I like to make all the time. This is within group relationships that get a little bit better. That also comes at a cost that among group relationships get a little bit more problematic, as we all know. But anyway, there could be the possibility that maybe the ecological reasoning behind why is it that birds cooperate more in environments that are difficult could somehow be related to human beings. So I started thinking, well, what if I start actually looking at this particular question? And I started realizing that there are several mechanisms that could be contributing to this that I needed to account for. First of all, we know that part of the reason why that map could be like that is because a lot of those societies in places that we see blue tend to be related to each other, so they could have inherited from a common ancestor the same kind of trait. It could also be the case that people tend to copy each other, and because societies that tend to live close to each other tend to be related to each other, they also tend to have similar languages, they could also interact more, they could exchange ideas. It could be some sort of like horizontal transmission. Or alternatively, it could also be other types of selection. It could be something related to social structures, like how complex the political society was, or whether there's personal property or not, where you need to police whether people are doing bad things or not. Or at the very end of that list was my pet idea, that was this ecology. So I said, okay, cool. We have a set of potential culprits. Let's use the same kind of tools that we do in evolutionary ecology, and let's try to see whether we can find anything. And the model that are basically kind of like set out to test was a very simple one, in which we was asking, is the probability of believing in one of these, in this high moralizing, high gods, is it correlated to phylogeny, to this potential for copying, to the social traits that we talked about, which include all these other things, and to ecology? And I want to go relatively quickly through this, but the brief answer was that yes, we found that actually we have really good evidence that the probability of belief increases in more unstable habitats. The story is a little bit more complex than that, but I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus is that after we did this model, the really dramatic thing that we found out was that we could actually explain those beliefs with an amazing level of certainty. So in this particular case, we're talking about a logistic regression. So instead of R-squared, what we used to assess how good our model was is we use this area under the curve, which basically compares the false positive to the true positive rate. And the higher the number it is, the better your ability to predict the cases properly. It turns out that in social sciences, people kind of like get delirious, like super happy when you get an AUC of around 75 to 80%. That's already like, holy, wow, amazing, mind-blowing. We got a 91%. And it was like, whoa, like we can really, with just basically 5 aspects, 5 things that we can measure from these societies, I can tell you with a very high degree of certainty if that society believes or not in this particular kind of God. The thing that most struck me was that actually a lot of that variance was explained by ecology, and I thought like, wow, like I'm really learning something about mechanism. But then I did the next thing, which is for the young people in the audience, it's always the thing that you have to do, but it's not necessarily the best thing that you can do, which is actually pursue this a little bit more. And then I realized that actually when you look at the other things, yes, there's evidence that individually each of them explains something that the other one doesn't, but a vast majority of this variance is actually explained jointly by all of these things. So when we think about mechanism, this 91% number that seemed to be so amazing and so great, really like, it really falls apart because we really didn't really understand the system. We cannot tell you for sure which of these, we can tell you that all of these things matter, but I cannot tell you which one is really the one that is driving the system the most, which is something that intuitively you would like to know. So what I'm going to be talking about today is not about religion, but it's about a different aspect that is also, in my view, almost as, or sometimes even more fundamental to human nature, which is the evolution of agriculture. And the reason why I'm going to be talking about that today is because I'm going to be using this as an example of how my lab has tried to address questions of mechanism in somewhat creative but yet comparative ways to try to address these issues. And I'm going to try to make a case as to why this kind of comparative study that I showed you initially is going to fall ultimately short in helping us understand how things got to be the way that they are. Again, I don't think I have definite answers, but I think that we can contribute with the tools that we have in evolutionary ecology. We can contribute somewhat to these discussions. And I'm just going to show you 3 different ways that I think that are innovative, slightly different. Maybe you don't think about it that way, but that help us think about phenomena or questions that we've had for the longest time. And what I'm going to focus this talk on is these 3 very simple questions. Why did agriculture start? When and where it started? How did it spread so fast? And how did it affect subsequent human evolution? So 3, I would argue, fundamental questions about our own species that are really difficult to answer because a lot of these things happened way before we had writing systems. So way before we could actually document these things and we could actually have a historical record of them. So let me tell you why I focus on those questions and why I think that they're important. when we think about modern humans, it turns out that we've been around for anything between 300 and 200,000 years. There's debate about the actual date, but around that ballpark we've been existing in this world. And the key thing is that for most of our existence, we managed to do entirely well, perfectly happily as a species, finding our food and sustenance through hunting and gathering. And only very recently, about 12,000 years ago, suddenly agriculture starts popping out. And not just in one place, but in 18 different places around the world that we know of, at least 18 different places, independently, without, as far as we can tell, any contact between these independent origins. It starts popping out in different places, and very soon it becomes the dominant mode of subsistence of all of our species. So we transform from a species that depends on the land to a species that transforms the land and produces its own food. Think about it. That is fundamental. That is the essence of what allows us to be here, having a university, political complexity that allows us to gather in groups as big as we do, that allows us to maintain all these social structures that we enjoy today. So the evolution of agriculture is something that is not trivial. It's integral to our own species. So the question then is, why did it happen just around here? And why did it happen in these places? And that, again, it's really difficult to know because the information that we have on each one of those is really nice records of what happened when you see the first contact between humans and domesticates, when you see the first genetic modifications of domesticates, but it's really hard to make from those observations. You have to do another level of abstraction to start to see patterns. So the question is, can we help answer this question? Now, the first thing that becomes really evident is when you think about potential reasons why things happen around the same time in all these places, is that there could be some general pattern. So for example, people have actually suggested that part of the reason why agriculture happened is because human groups were becoming to be bigger, and they were starting to overuse their environment. They were not able to obtain all of their sustenance just from hunting and gathering. That created the need to find other sources, be creative about how you produce food or how you get food, and that necessity could have driven the evolution of this radically new mode of subsistence. Alternatively, people have suggested, wait a second, if you're going to try to kind of like plant something, let it be there for 6 months and then eat it, you cannot be in dire straits by that point. It's going to be really difficult to figure out that there's so much investment in getting agriculture going on that it potentially could be really difficult to evolve it when you really need it. And some people have taken inspirations from groups like the Greek that have actually written about this and have shown us that one of the best things that helped promote their culture was the ability of having free time. So people have said like, oh, maybe what could be happening is that this radical different thing that happened in human agriculture has something to do with the fact that there was a surplus, that human groups were not pushed to the brink, and they had the ability to try out new things, try out things that were not necessarily the things that they were doing before, and they had the ability to fail sometimes and eventually to get that thing going. There's also the hypothesis that I jokingly like to say, the killjoy hypothesis, which is in every single time you have somebody that says all of these situations are completely unique, and I personally do not subscribe to this way of seeing the world, but I don't really think that human beings necessarily are so unique and different from the rest of the scala natura that we should have like everything our own special way. But this hypothesis may be right in the sense that maybe the things that drove each of these places were completely different from each other. Maybe there's no relationship, no general mechanism, but different things. So it could be the possibility that there's some regional uniqueness. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that we have some clues already from archaeology, from paleontology, from climate records of what could be going on, and both of these hypotheses could actually take some information from it. And the thing that I want to point out is that when you look at climate information for this period of time, you realize that the time in which this agriculture is starting to happen is a time of profound transformation in terms of climate. Now, these curves that you see here, they look really beautiful, and you see this representation, but we're really talking about some cores in the Arctic that are telling us that something is happening in the world at that time, but we cannot really tell what is it that is happening at the specific places that we're thinking about. So we need a little bit more information to try to test these ideas. So the idea that we had at my lab was like, okay, well, what happens if we could somehow think about what the carrying capacity for hunter-gatherers was? If we had that kind of information, we could make the following prediction. You could say, hey, if the carrying capacity, so the environment is suddenly supporting more and more people, if it's becoming more permissive to people, that would be consistent with the idea that there's a surplus. The environment is constantly becoming better than you are. So, it's being more accommodating to the number of people that are around. That would be consistent more or less with the idea of surplus. In contrast, if the environment is becoming crappier and crappier, it's supporting less and less people, then that would be a good indication that maybe something is happening that is really constraining your ability to obtain food, and maybe the necessity hypothesis could be the one that is most informative. So how do you actually measure carrying capacity? This is something that we do routinely with species in ecology, but that it's really hard to do in humans, and it's even harder to do in humans that no longer exist. So one of the things that we tried to do was to think like, could we somehow predict the number of individuals that the environment is able to maintain when we look at just hunter-gatherers? So what we did is we took a current sample of hunter-gathering groups across the world. Fortunately, there's hunter-gatherers all around the world. And we looked at the environmental conditions in which they exist, and we look at the number of individuals of those groups that live under those environmental conditions. And we asked the question, how well can we predict the number of people that are supported by the environment under specific kinds of conditions? And the answer is that reasonably well, about 80%. We can explain about 80% of the variance. So it's not perfect, but we have some sense of like how many people live depending on what is the temperature, what is the precipitation, the variation in yearly conditions, month-to-month variation, predictability, those kinds of things. We also add to this some social things like ownerships and residential mobility, because we know that those things matter. And what we find is this basic structural equation model that, without going into too much detail, allows us eventually to predict population density, which is not the same as carrying capacity, but it tells us more or less how many people can we expect under specific conditions. So armed with that knowledge, we can say, okay, cool, if we have this model and we were to build a map of the world by just applying this kind of model to the conditions that we find in every different part of the world, how many people do you expect? And what you find is that there are places, and typically those are the places where we do find a majority of the hunter-gathering groups, where you find more people, and places where you find less people. Like the environment can sustain less or more people depending on what this model is telling you. Now, we also have the advantage that we could simulate paleoclimate. We could have paleoclimate from all the sources of information that we can. So we can do that not just for the present, but we could do it for different samplings at different times, at different points in time. So we simulated this densities of people across a 21,000 year at 1,000 year timescales, to basically ask the question: how is the pressure that the environment is posing on these populations changing over time? The next thing that we did was we say, okay, cool, now let's go specifically to these areas and look at around the time in which we have evidence for the evolution of agriculture, and let's ask the question, do we find patterns that are consistent with the surplus hypothesis, consistent with the need hypothesis, or just randomly happening from one to the other? What we find is the following, and let me first show you a little bit about talk about a little bit about what these graphs are. This is basically time from the present. Present is around here. The solid lines are basically telling us the point in which we have archaeological evidence of the first time that a domesticate is genetically modified. We know that by that point agriculture has happened. Humans have changed that species in one way or the other. The dotted line is an indication of when we have some sort of evidence that the domesticate and the human population come in contact. So we know that they co-occur. So somewhere in between the dashed and the red line is the evolution of agriculture for each one of these places. And what you find is for almost every single one, there's a really clear pattern that the environment is becoming more permissive. It's becoming so that with time, the environment is tolerating more and more and more people. And for the one that really doesn't fit the pattern, first of all, in general, the pattern is going up, but also this is the first point of contact. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's when agriculture actually started. So around the time where we have an evidence that really this is when it started, several thousand years before, conditions are starting to be better and better. So in general, you can actually say that these models tend to be consistent or support more the idea that that there was a surplus rather than the idea that there's a need, that there was a need. So not fully answers the question, but at least it provides a different perspective on things that we cannot record historically. Now, I'm not going to fully talk about this, but I do want to briefly mention about the question of why what is it so special about these places? And I want to note that in one of the big mysteries in people that study the evolution of agriculture is that when people have tried to ask the question, is there a correlation between environmental conditions and the evolution of agriculture, they find all kinds of answers. So some people find that yes, it's correlated, that like some sort of variable tends to be correlated with the emergence of agriculture, and some people find that either is correlated in the opposite direction or not correlated at all. It's all like really confusing when you look at that literature. And people argue and bicker about like who's right about this thing. And I think that the reason for that is that we're looking at the wrong kind of analysis. Because think about it, agriculture is just a big term for very different things. Domesticating a camel is not the same as domesticating koi fish. Or growing rice, you need really humid, wet, inundated places, and growing olive trees, you need really dry Mediterranean climate. So finding one single direction for everything doesn't work. That's not the kind of things that you should be doing. So an alternative approach, which we actually took, was to say, let's look at all the different species that have been domesticated. So in these early times in these places. And there's a list of roughly 115, 130 species. We took each one of those and we did ecological niche models, and we overlaid those ecological niche models to try to figure out which places in the world had more of this species. And if you do the assumption for one moment that maybe those 115 first species that we domesticated were possibly, most of those were the easiest things to domesticate, which is a fairly reasonable assumption. You start asking the question, maybe these places where things happen because you have a higher prevalence of those easy domesticable things. And what we find is that, yes, indeed, that is true. So they are special in that sense. There are places where there's a greater confluence of things that are easy to domesticate. But the thing that I want to point out, and unfortunately I don't have the data here today, but the thing that I want to point out is that when you look at other parts of the world, it turns out that there are other parts of the world where you also find the same opportunity. So what this kind of analysis is telling us is that as almost everything in humans, there's this combination between opportunity and chance. And like sometimes you have your group, you have that Einstein that realizes like, hey, we can do this. And when that happens, your entire society transforms in ways that go beyond kind of like this basic. So the reason I just want to talk about this really quickly is because it goes to the fact that the diffusion of ideas and the emergence of ideas are processes that are really fundamental that we need to think about, even in this broad comparative context that I'm talking about today. All right, so we talked a little bit about when and the where. So let's talk about the spreading of agriculture. And the reason why the spreading of agriculture is really an interesting question is because we have really good evidence, primarily from Europe, that once agriculture happened, it basically spread like wildfire all over the place. So we find within really very short periods of time, it went from the Fertile Crescent up into Europe. Those kinds of things have been really well documented. To the point in which this spread of culture is not really explained just by the colonization of groups, which is what typically we would expect, the way in which ideas kind of like spread. So groups are successful, they start expanding, and their diaspora takes with them those kinds of ideas. It seems that there's something more. And before telling you about what that something more is, I want to first go back to this idea of all this conflated processes that makes it really difficult to think about mechanism, and to tell you a little bit more about why I think that this happens. So in the case of religious beliefs, we're kind of like making the argument that traits could be clustered because environments there tend to be pockets with specific conditions and a specific social behavior tends to be adaptive under those ecological settings. The problem is that when you start realizing environments, yes, tend to correlate with each other, like environments are more similar the closer you are to each other, but it turns out that societies that are closer to each other tend to be relatives and tend to be more closely related phylogenetically. So it could just be that all of these guys are red because the ancestor of those guys was a red guy. So immediately you see that environment and phylogeny tend to be correlated to the point that it's really difficult to tell them apart. The thing becomes even worse when you realize that this potential for transmission could also mean that all of these guys could be red because they're so close to each other that they could share this thing, like, hey, this thing really worked for us and everybody's working with it right now. So the reason why today you see a pattern of clumped red dots here could be either because they copied each other, because they inherited from the same thing, or because selectively it's advantageous to do it in this specific ecological setting. The problem is that from the patterns of just looking at the present data, and even after you account for phylogeny and all this stuff, as I've shown, you can't really tell what the mechanism, what the actual mechanism was the thing that really drove. Is it that ecology drove everything and the effect of the others are just there because of the correlations between ecology and phylogeny? Or is it that phylogeny drove everything? Those kinds of things you cannot really answer with just a broad comparative thing. But there are other ways in which you could ask questions. And one of the things I want to point out is that fortunately the correlation between environmental conditions and proximity and all these kinds of things is not perfect. So the bigger the scale that you do, for example, if you go global in your projects, you tend to see more the effects of these things and to be able to tease apart those little like slivers of unique contributions. But again, that doesn't give you everything. Another thing that you could do would be to say like, hey, what if instead of thinking about the present and explaining the past, we think about simulating the process under very well-known mechanisms. If I knew what mechanism 1 is and what mechanism 2 is, I could simulate it. I could collect a series of statistics, and in this particular case, let's just use a made-up statistic, y, and hopefully you're going to find one statistical parameter that allows full separation such that mechanism 1 tends to produce higher values of the statistic and mechanism 2 tends to produce the other one. So if you look at reality, ideally, you would be able to say, hey, reality falls here, and I know by simulation that these kinds of values are unlikely to be produced by mechanism 1, so you know, okay, cool, now I know what is the mechanism for this, even though there's correlations and other things. Now, in terms of religious beliefs, we don't have an idea of those mechanisms so well, but in terms of the spread of agriculture, we have beautifully laid out hypotheses about how the spread of agriculture could have been so fast. And very briefly, I want to tell you about the two main competing ideas. One of them is that agriculture was just so beneficial and so great that individuals immediately started copying each other. They started seeing their neighbors are doing this weird thing over there, and they're starting to extract animals. They're hanging out with camels or like this kinds of stuff. They started copying each other. So the power of diffusion, of copying what your neighbors are doing. The other version is this version that is kind of like the whole premise of guns, germs, and steel. It is that as agricultural groups developed, once you have agriculture, you can have more people in them. You can have separation of labor. You can have armies. You can have political complexity. You basically become competitively superior over other groups. So it is possible that what happened was that agricultural groups became competitively superior and were able to basically take over the land, either expel or kill their neighbors and take over that, making the process of cultural diffusion much more quick than you would expect. Both of these processes, by the way, assume that there is some what we call demic diffusion, which is that both of these recognize the fact that societies tend to pass their cultural traits to the next generation, and if there's a possibility for the generation to have a diaspora somewhere else, that diaspora is going to take, on average, the traits of the parent society. So that first kind of like mechanism, this idea that you inherit traits from your parents, that is baked into both of them. And that should produce a situation in which, yes, you tend to see that the distribution of traits at the tips is basically depending upon inheritance and mutation and those kinds of like basic processes. If this diffusion was a possibility, you should be able to see that every now and then trait values jump from one part of the phylogeny to the other, but that the basic structure of the phylogeny stays the same. So we have a very specific mechanism in which you say, hey, if in my model I allow neighbors to copy each other with certain probability, then suddenly we start seeing that the trait spreads in the tips without necessarily altering the phylogeny. The key realization is that the takeover mechanism is different. In the takeover mechanism, we're actively saying, hey, this group takes over, or one of these groups takes over the space, and you force the extinction of one branch and you replace it with one of your descendants. So you can see how the phylogeny, if you are talking about a situation in which you're actively eliminating a group, a competing group, you should be pruning the phylogeny in some way, and you should be changing it physically. So we thought like, oh, maybe if we pay attention to the phylogenetic structure of the cultural trees, and the geographic distribution of these traits, we might be able to somehow find one of those parameters that allows us to make those distinctions. Now, a fourth possibility is that all of the mechanisms are involved. So you have a combination of takeover and a combination of cultural diffusion. And by the way, demic is baked on everyone. So we allow demic to happen in everyone. But anyway, so if you have these four things, you could actually simulate the world, and you could start saying, okay, let's allow a possibility for all of these particular mechanisms to happen in the specific way that I am thinking. So in this particular way, I only allow yellows to become reds through cultural diffusion. In this particular case, I allow only takeovers and demic diffusion. In this particular case, I allow everything. And what you can see kind of like cursorily is that the phylogenies kind of like look differently in these things. Maybe you have what you would expect in takeover, that you have like this pruning and this very recent diversity. Those kinds of things you start kind of like, if you squint, you kind of like start seeing them. But this is just one simulation. And there's a lot of different parameters that go into this model, so you actually have to do some sort of like sensitivity analysis. So we repeated this process not once, but 40,000 times. And with those 40,000 times, we started accumulating the distribution of these parameters, hoping that there would be the one kind of like thing that we would be able to pinpoint as the smoking gun of the process. And what we discovered, to our like horror and dismay after months of cluster computing, was that there was no smoking gun. That when you look at this stuff, you can't just use one single parameter to tell this apart. Of course, that was kind of like to be expected from what we knew at the beginning, so it was not as big as a shock as I'm pretending right now, but it was still a big shock. So the next step was to say, well, could we find through correlations among these parameters some sort of signal that tells us whether one process is more important than the other? And what we did for that was to use machine learning, which basically involved taking all the thousands of cases that we simulated, training an algorithm, and asking whether we really could tell the difference apart. Now, I don't know the background of most of this audience, so I'm briefly going to explain how machine learning works. It basically involves taking a set of known data points, basically each of the simulations. I know exactly how I did the simulation, feeding them up through these different kind of like versions of the model. So I chop and dice the data in different ways. So in some cases, for example, I choose some variables and some cases, and each one uses different variables in different cases. In essence, it's like you're training your statistical models with different experiences, just like what human beings would do. Like if you're exposed to a certain background, you tend to think about a certain problem in one way. That is kind of like what this particular technique is doing, is allowing to looking at different ways of looking at the data, what kind of conclusions you would do. And for each one of these, you make a decision tree, which is done through this classification and regression tree technique that basically classifies every single one of the cases that you could get, depending on, hey, do you have phylogenetic parameter 1? Is it bigger than 1 or less than 1? So you go one way or the other. You have all these kinds of like very basic decision trees that take you to classify every single case. Now, at the end, you can do several things. You end up with this, which is what we call the random forest, and which is a cute name for saying that you have all these trees that you use. And each one of these makes a vote. So if I give them new set of parameters and I say, hey, classify, tell me what kind of case is it. This one classifies this one classifies the other. And each one votes and says, like, this is the mechanism that I think it is. So you can use that to either feed reality. So you say, like, I have these 40 parameters that I actually measured in reality. Tell me what you guys collectively think that is the answer. But you could also, which is more important, you could use another set of simulated data that you already know to ask the question of, well, how good is the answer that this particular algorithm is giving me? Which this, I would argue, is much more important than the other. You could get an answer from anything, but the answer could be crappy answer. So what you really want to make sure is that this algorithm is somehow telling you something that you can trust. So there's two questions here. One is like, what does the algorithm tell me about reality? And the second one is how much I can trust the answer that the algorithm is telling me. So let's look at the first part here. What we find is that when we take all these different phylogenetic parameters that are basically telling you how much branching there is, whether is it how ladder-like is the tree, whether the branches tend to be short at the end and big at the beginning, those kinds of phylogenetic parameters, one of those, and you take the distribution of the traits, like for example, does the trait tend to be clumped or dispersed? Does it that you tend to see patches of egg size? Those kinds of parameters. You feed all of those things into the decision tree, everybody votes, and the answer is that the most likely scenario is a situation in which you have demic plus cultural diffusion. So not the war scenario that we're talking in guns, germs, and steel, but more a situation in which people are copying each other. So how confident can we be in that answer? Well, when you look at other simulated data and you feed something, so for example, you feed a culture, something that is really just cultural, your probability of making a mistake is, you can read it in several different ways. So if it's telling you that it's a cultural thing, most likely is going to be just cultural plus demic. And the kinds of errors that you would make would be that demic, which we know that it always has demic, but it's very unlikely that if takeover was there, you're going to find it is less than 3% the possibility that you would have takeover, but you wouldn't detect it. So bottom line, we find very strong evidence that the most likely mechanism is cultural diffusion. And I want to emphasize this specific thing that is most likely. The reason why I don't have a more confident answer right now is because the phylogeny that we're using is a work in progress. So even though all this process has been done, the cultural phylogeny involving all the languages of the world is still a work in progress. With the latest version that we have, we find this answer, but until we have the final phylogeny, I will not be able to tell you for sure. But what I do want to say is that we can use this approach of a forward simulation, comparing our simulations and the parameters we extract from the simulations with the parameters we can extract from reality, as a way to tease apart mechanism in situations that seem to be impossible to tease apart just from looking at the present. All right, cool. So now let's look at a completely different question, but also related to agriculture, that exemplifies another way that I think that evolutionary methods can contribute to all of these important questions about human history. And this is, how did the evolution of agriculture transform the way in which we do our business? Now, of course, that question can be approached in many different ways, and there's a lot of social work that has shown that, yes, once agriculture started, societies became more complex, more stratified, more unequal. A lot of different things have happened with the evolution of society, of agriculture. Religions become more organized, like basically everything about human nature changes. The thing that I wanted to focus on was something slightly different, and it starts here. When you look at the world, you realize that the world is conformed of like dramatically different landscapes, from the really cold places in the poles, or like at least close to the poles, to dry regions in different parts of the world, tropical jungles, pretty much you name it. Each one of these has unique challenges, both ecological and physical. And those challenges have driven the evolution of very distinct communities of organisms. Each one of those places tends to have different kinds of birds, different kinds of reptiles, different kinds of mammals, plants, microbes. Things look very different, and just this picture shows you just how different things look in these places. But the key thing that I want to point out is that all of those places are colonized by us, which makes it really dramatic to think about how our species, to an extent that no other species that we know of, has been able to take those challenges and turn them into opportunities, and has been able to go from something that most likely looked like this to something that now looks like this, or like this, or like this. How did we go from a situation in which we had a nice kind of like tropical environment, dry nicely, into the ability to go to those very different places? How does our climate niche evolve? Now, in evolutionary biology, we tend to approach this kind of question by looking at models of the tempo and the mode of evolution, which are fancy terms to just say, well, how quickly do traits evolve, and do they evolve punctuationally or gradually, those kinds of things. And one of the ways in which we do that is by fitting different models with different assumptions to the data and asking the question of which of these models most best explains the patterns that we see. So for example, just to give you some ideas, the kinds of models that we fit are the following. You could assume that a given trait evolves in just a random process, a Brownian motion process, such that over time it just changes stochastically as you go. And if you assume that that trait not only evolves in a lineage, but it evolves in multiple different lineages that are connected at different points in time, and you allow that every time that lineages separate each other, you allow each of those lineages to evolve independently, you find that as time goes by, what you would naturally expect is that the trait space that you're occupying becomes progressively bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a very simple kind of thing, and we can measure it with just one single parameter, which is this sigma, which basically tells us how quickly, or basically, sigma is just basically the spread at a specific point in time, but it's a measure of how fast traits evolve. Bigger sigma means more widespread at a given point in time. Alternatively, you could actually say, well, maybe this model is too simple, and we should actually think about some other things. So we know, for example, that our physiologies tend to be constrained by certain things, that we have some temperature that tends to be an optimum, and that once we go away from that temperature, we cannot just evolve kind of like the ability to be at minus 20 degrees. We somehow are constrained in our ability to evolve. So you could think about a process in which, yes, there is some stochastic change, but there are some constraints and some optimum. So in this particular model, you add an optimum, you add a parameter that's called a pool, and the rate is still the same. And just to give you a comparison, these two processes are simulated with the exact same rate. The only thing that I've done different in these two things is to change the pool and make it harder to go away from your optimum. Imagine that like a rubber band that basically says, as soon as you start getting too far away, I feel uncomfortable and I pull you back down. And that basically means that even though you could evolve really quickly out of this, you cannot go farther away because that pull keeps you going, bringing you back to that optimum. So anyway, so these are two arguably unrealistic assumptions about the process of evolution, but that could capture some ideas about what happens. But in the case of agriculture, in the case of our own climate niche, one thing that you might say is like, wait a second. A big part of adapting to a dry landscape or to a wet landscape or whatever it is your ability to actually find something to eat and find a way to survive in there. So you might think that, for example, the ability to find a new thing that you could kill is easier. It's easier to actually like just move to another place and just kill some other animal than take with you another set of like domesticates, either adapt them to the local climate or figure out how to domesticate a new set of things. You might think that there are reasons to believe that if you have one or the other modes of subsistence, you might be able to evolve your climate niche at different speeds or at different rates with different pools. So for that case, you can actually modify the models of evolution that you have by allowing the parameters to be dependent on that trait. And in this particular case, for example, we allow that the speed of evolution varies for the blue and the red lineages. In this particular case, you can think about agriculturalists versus hunter-gatherers. Or you could say like, hey, the hunter-gatherers have different optima than agriculturists, or they could have everything different. They could have different optimum, different pools, different speeds, all these kinds of things. So the challenge now is to actually try to fit all the data that you have to all these different kinds of models and try to figure out which one of them best explains the patterns that you see today. And by patterns, I mean you actually have a global phylogeny of languages. This, by the way, is the hypothesis that we're working on. With a distribution of traits, you can see that most societies have some sort of farming and some choice societies are hunter-gatherers. And then you could ask the question, what kinds of processes explain what we see today based on this structure, this phylogenetic structure that we know or that we infer from language. The place is just to basically tell you that the traits that we use for this come from this open source data set that you can just find by dplace.org on the web. All right, anyway, so we have all these different models to fit, and the question is which one fits the best. Before I show you which one fits the best, I want to make a point that we can also explore how this evolution proceeds. And one way to do that is by looking at what we call this mode of evolution. And you could actually look at the phylogenetic distance between two societies and ask how similar they are. And one prediction would be that the closer you are, the closer phylogenetically two tips are, you might expect them to be more similar. So this is thousands of years for their last common ancestor. You would find that really close societies tend to be really similar, and really distant societies, you cannot distinguish the similarity from chance. So this is basically something that you would expect. But one thing that becomes really clear is that if instead of using thousands of years, you use the nodes that separate them, the pattern becomes much more clean. And the reason why, both for temperature and precipitation, and the reason why that is the case is because most of the evolution in terms of climate happens when an actual society leaves, like a diaspora leaves the place where they were and goes and explores a new place. The climate could change, yes, that is true, but most of the evolution happens when you actually go somewhere else and encounter different challenges, and either you go extinct or you stay, and you manage how to do it. So those are the opportunities that present the greatest opportunity for you to evolve. Anyway, that's a little sideline. So let's go back to what is the model that best explains the evolution of these traits. And when we look at the evolution of our temperature envelope, our ability to tolerate temperature, what we find is that the best model is one model in which everything is different. And let me show you a little bit about how those results look like. Here I'm showing both agriculturalists in red and foragers in blue, and the distribution of different traits, and here I'm just separating them in a mirror image. And one of the things that I want to point out is that these models basically fossilize the nodes before the emergence of agriculture. So we force these models do not allow an estimation to be agriculturalist before the time we know that agriculture did not happen. So this is a special version of these models. But what we find is that by around this time is where agriculture is starting to happen. And what we find is that by that time, humans had already covered most of the temperature range that we were to cover. But as soon as agriculture emerges, we find that immediately there is kind of like a displacement. You can't really see too much, but all these are black because these are the red versions here. There's a displacement of societies, and the foragers kind of like tend to be pushed to the edge. And in some points, they get to the really extremely cold places where agriculture doesn't happen. Now, the key insights of this particular model is that we find that the optimum is very different. The temperature, the preferred temperature for agriculture is around 23 degrees, whereas for the hunter-gatherers around 17 degrees. And that is partly because all these really cold societies are pulling that optimum down. But we also find that the agriculturists have much stronger constraints, 2 orders of magnitude. So they're less able to evolve out of their preferred temperature envelope. They cannot just willy-nilly go into like really extreme environments, partly because it's not just about the humans that are evolving, but also about the species that are co-evolving with them. If you want to take your agricultural system with you, somehow the species that belong in that system also have to adapt with you. And that seems to be hard, which also takes you to the fact that the speed of evolution in terms of the temperature, adaptation to temperature, is much slower in agriculturalist groups than in foragers. Now, when you look at precipitation, the pattern is very different. What we find in this particular case is actually that surprisingly the model that best reflects what we see is a simple model of Brownian evolution. And in this particular case, both groups, we estimate, have the same speed of evolution. But again, I want to show something slightly different here, which is the fact that around the time that agriculture starts, the humans had only occupied a fraction of the range of precipitation that we can as a species today. Partly, you see that there's a really great expansion into really extremely dry places. So again, this is a logarithmic scale, which means that we're talking about really dry versus like really, really, really dry. And this is allowed basically by things like camels, goats, and those kinds of things really expand our niche. So here we see an indication that agriculture expanded our niche, but doesn't necessarily mean that it was faster. So in general, what we find is that this climate niche, or that we have evidence that the climate niche of human groups expanded as these diasporas colonized new places. That the matter in which precipitation and temperature evolved is slightly different. We find some evidence that in terms of precipitation, there was in terms of temperature, there's strong indication that there was this competitive exclusion, that agriculture basically took over the nice warm place where agriculture is more useful, whereas hunter-gatherers were kind of like taken out into the fringes, whereas in terms of precipitation, agriculture really expanded our ability to explore these really, really dry places of Earth. Yeah, this is basically another way of saying the same thing that I just said. The one thing that we don't know at this point is what is cause and what is effect. We don't know, for example, if really agriculture is pushed out foragers, or whether agriculturists exploit opportunities that foragers didn't have. We're working on that, and I cannot really give you an answer for that at this point. But that takes me, I don't know, I think we're around the time that this should be getting over. So that takes me to a final kind of like point that I want to make. We've explored these three questions that I think that are pretty fundamental about our understanding of our own species. I've provided some perspective that comes from a slightly different way of looking at the data, but I want to point out that at no point in time I feel that the answers that I've given are definitive. These are supposed to be taken as collaborations between what we can provide as ecology and evolutionary biologists to what people in archaeology, in anthropology, and all these kinds of things in all these kinds of fields can contribute. And I feel that these kinds of projects, even though they're not completely giving us the full answer, they're exciting because they really make us talk to each other in ways that we don't normally do it. And in that light, I just want to kind of like emphasize that all of this is really a collaborative effort that could have not been possible without the funding and support of Russell Gray and the Max Planck Institute, the friendship and support from Mike Gavin, which is kind of like a co-leader in most of these projects, and most importantly, the hard work of like many postdocs. I'm only showing 3 from my lab, but there's at least 2 more people that have actually done a lot of the work that I've shown today. And this is also like other people that are involved indirectly in this Deep Place Collaborative. So thank you again for bearing with me, and I hope that there's some questions that I could address right now.
Hey, Carlos, really cool stuff. So you're mapping traits on language phylogenies. How does that differ conceptually from were you to map traits on instead phylogenies of genetic inheritance,
Yes.
or networks or phylogenies?
Yeah, so that's a really key conceptual question, and I'm glad you bring up. So when we think, so let me first go back to the idea of like how we explore this in biology. The idea that the reason why we use a phylogeny is because it's an independent hypothesis about how organisms are related. So you want to think, for example, how morphology has evolved and how it's correlated with other kinds of things. You want to have some sort of scaffold that allows you to tell that this group of organisms are close relative or distant relatives. In terms of cultural traits, what matters is not your genetics, but it matters your cultural lineage. Because most of the way in which we inherit cultural traits, we don't inherit it biologically. We inherit it from the transfer of ideas from one generation to the next. Language phylogenies, to the best of our ability, seems to be one of the things that captures the best how these societies are related to each other in terms of how they pass on these traits that we're interested in. So they provide the closest thing to that independent phylogenetic hypothesis of how cultural change happens and what groups tend to be related to each other. So there's been other kinds of projects that have shown, for example, that language phylogenies really predict patterns of dispersal of people or colonization of people through like the Thai Peninsula, or how they occupied the oceanic islands, or things like that. We have some indication that that when you explore similarities in language, you really capture kind of like the similarities in culture that go along with it. So ultimately, I guess where I'm going is that a cultural phylogeny provides you an independent idea of how related the cultures are by descent, or not by descent, but by this vertical transfer of information and technology that allows you to do, in essence, the same thing that you would be doing in a biological equivalent.
So you'd expect more inference of higher rates of vertical transmission maybe when, say, agriculture is mapped on a language phylogeny than were it mapped on a phylogeny of like genetic material.
Yeah. So okay. So there. Yes. So part of what there's several things that are encapsulated in that question. So I'm going to try to parse them out. So, for example, we know of cases in which genetically people have been entirely replaced in one specific spot of the world, like the genetics of the people have changed entirely from one generation to the other, potentially through colonization or some weird kind of like event. But the culture, the language has remained the same. So that kind of thing happens. If that were to happen, if that were to be common, we don't know the extent to which that is common. I think that would be rare. But if that were to happen, you would have a situation in which the genetic tree and the phylogeny, the cultural phylogeny would be very different. Your inference would be very different about the level of relatedness. The other thing that you could expect is that it really doesn't matter, for example, if you don't have to be blood relative to be able to inherit some sort of concept from the older generation. So I would expect that some cultural traits are going to map with genetic data, because genetic data tends to be highly correlated with, like you tend to like teach your offspring, and the group tends to be like that. But I don't necessarily think that would happen all the time.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. That was really fascinating. So I have a question about data quality. So my impression is ecological data often sucks. I'm going to guess that the deep place data sucks even more. In terms of quality. I'm sorry to my colleagues in Anthro.
I guess it depends on what sucks for what. We'll talk about that later.
So my question is really how you assess the quality of the model fit. So, for example, in the Brownian motion one that was good for temperature, and the Ornstein oil impact one was for other ones. So, is there a way of assessing quality of data associated with the deep place, and is that taken into account? And in doing this in a standard way, you would maybe do a subsampling of data and then see when the model falls apart, kind of a thing.
Yes. So I'm glad that you asked that question. So there's different answers to that. I hope that this doesn't obfuscate the question too much, but it depends on which project we're talking about.
Yeah. I was talking about the last
all right.
set of.
So I'm actually going to go to another project to give you the first one.
Okay.
So if you go back to to the simulation project, actually, if you go back to the beginning, let me see. If you go back to the beginning, give me 1 second. If you go back to this project, you realize, for example, like this is an example of like how sucky the data really is, and that I glossed over because we don't have too much time, but this is a good time to point it out. We don't know what the residential mobility was in the past, or we don't know what the resource ownership was in the past. So how could we even make any statements about this kinds of situation? The way that we approach that problem is by doing pretty comprehensive sensitivity analyses. So for example, one way in which we did is instead of running this model one time, we run the model 10,000 times, each one of them making a different assumption about what the mobility was, what the ownership was for each one of these. So all of these projects kind of like have baked in sensitivity analysis that kind of like reflect that basically says, to what extent this is our uncertainty about these particular traits affecting the conclusion that we have. And this is one case in which it just so happens that yes, these two things are important for the model, for the predictive this, but for the thing that we're interested in, which is it a positive or negative slope, it doesn't matter. So that's a case in which we can still make a statement with quite a bit of uncertainty,
Right.
but the thing that we're interested in is not affected by that.
Got it. That's exactly what I was asking.
So there are other kinds of ways in which uncertainty, my lab is really like all about uncertainty. So phylogeny, for example, is we tend to think about phylogenetic hypothesis as the tree. It turns out that there's not one tree, there's like quite a bit of uncertainty in that. So all of these projects are not run on one tree, but they're typically run on thousands of slightly different versions of phylogenetic hypothesis, because there's different ways in which you could interpret the data for assuming what are the relationships between this. So that's another level of uncertainty that we incorporate. And there's yet another level in which we approach this phylogenetic, so this data quality uncertainty, or assumption uncertainty. In the simulation project, in the project that we were Actually, I'm really liking this feature of the map because I can go really quickly from one to the other. In this project, when we do things like this, and we simulate all these different things, I didn't go through this, but there's 19 parameters that honestly I have no idea what the value should be. So for example, at what rate, how likely it is that one society copies the other? Is it 0? Is it 100%? Anywhere in between? I really do not know. So all of these projects are based on the possibility that throughout, instead of doing it one time, you do it thousands of times. Each time you doing it in a slightly different way. And you ask the question, for the thing that I am interested in, does it matter that the data suck? In some cases, it does matter, and then we don't publish. In some cases, it doesn't matter, and then we do.
So it's all about robustness of the key results to uncertainty in the structure of the model and the parameters in the model.
Yeah, so one thing that we tend to forget is that bad data could still lead to good answers. It depends on what your question is. If you realize that the reason why the data are bad matter for your conclusion, stop. But it might be that the reason why the data are bad. So I can't remember who I was talking this morning. We were talking about, for example, eBird data. eBird data, like the people go and report how many birds of each species they see. And they say like, oh, today in my walk, I saw 100 robins. And like nobody in their right mind is gonna believe that you really saw 100 robins. Maybe you did, maybe you don't. Like we have like absolutely no certainty that it's 100 individuals that you saw. But you can tell with no shadow of a doubt, this person saw a robin. So it really depends what you're using the data for, and sometimes the data don't suck as much.
Thanks.
Just know that we are on those slides. So on the cultural hypothesis, how the horizontal transmission is done. So how they copy the other. I think I think you said because it's better that agriculture is better, so you will copy them, or is
so
it?
you're asking me about the mechanism how
Yeah.
copying could happen, or
Yeah.
how do we incorporate that into the model?
Yeah, no. In the model, how it is, because I don't know, but for me, so you said that there's the demic hypothesis, so they grow and they replace the other culture. But if, for example, the agriculture is something that increase your fitness and so you can grow bigger, if you don't have that, you will disappear anyway. So for sure, the other will grow. Then if you can see that the other are growing, you copy that. So you copy because they are growing, so you can somehow see that it's better. But you could just copy
Alright,
because
So you're so several things.
yeah.
So sorry, we're going to have to look under the hood for this model to answer that question. I'm going to try to do it really quick. Maybe we can talk about it more later.
Yeah, definitely.
But a lot of the things that you're talking about are those 19 parameters that I said that are
Okay.
important under the hood.
Yeah, because
And one of the things that you have to be really clear is to not confound them in such a way that you cannot separate them. So you could actually say like, well, what is the likelihood that you copy? And that in the model could be exemplified by just saying, okay, you take a specific probability, you draw a random number, and you say, if it is the time to copy, you look around your neighbors and you pick one, and you, whatever is, if that is different than mine, I pick it up. Simple. You could also, another parameter would be, well, if I'm agriculturalist, how likely am I to go extinct at a certain step of the model? So I might, if I'm agriculturalist, I might be better able to withstand environmental oscillations or whatever. You also have like the environmental changes that are happening in the model. All those are the parameters that we're dealing with. But the way in which we code this in the model is the following. As you can see, each one of these is a little point in the map. What we've done is we've taken the network of societies as we know it from something that's called the glottolog, which is a list of all the languages that we know that exist in the world at one point, for example, like at contemporary, which is roughly an approximation of the maximum number of groups that you could see, of human groups in the place. So each of these points is a place where we know that there's a society with a unique language, unique set of customs, beliefs, technologies, all these kinds of things. So what we do is in the map, we know those are areas that could be colonized. They not necessarily are going to be colonized. Sometimes there's going to be people in there, sometimes there's not going to be people. And so we start in one place that if you, like, let's start this again so you see it. They start around kind of like Ethiopia, Eritrea, around that place, and then they start expanding. Once we have 80% of the world colonized, we turn on, somebody is allowed to evolve agriculture from scratch in the areas of origin that we know that could happen. All of this is probabilistically, each time happens in different places. And then the question is, how does that red spread to the others? Is it just because as this group grows and we have a probability that it's going to split, then when it splits it goes to one of the neighbors, or is it just that you could copy it from so each one of them has the different assumptions. And the parameters that under the hood that we were talking about control all the things that you're asking.
Have you done any comparisons to other sort of cultural ideas, like the transmission of the idea of tools, or of I don't know whether you lump dogs in with agriculture, but these are conceptual ideas that could be culturally transmitted, and you might see the same type of spread patterns that you're seeing with agriculture.
Yeah. The quick answer is yes and no. So for example, two things that are really fundamental and associated with agriculture and have very similar patterns are the spread of the wheel and the spread of riding systems. And my lab is starting to work on those tangentially to test this idea. So there's another really cool idea in this Guns, Germs, and Steel book is the idea that there's some axis of orientation. And that when you look at the fates of people in Eurasia, they're very different from people in Africa or the Americas. So why is it that these two different groups of people ended up in such different places in terms of development? And one of the ideas is that when you look at Eurasia, it's a landmass that is all oriented roughly around the same latitude. So that means that basically innovations that were developed in one place in Eurasia could fairly easily be translocated to another place without major modification because the environment, in theory, was roughly similar. Whereas in Africa and the Americas, land masses are more longitudinally oriented and things change dramatically. So moving things from one, like you cannot take corn from the corn belt down to the tropics. It just doesn't work so well. So there are some ideas. People have tested that idea indirectly by looking, for example, at the shape of countries. It turns out that countries tend to be wider than they are tall. And they've used that as an indication that maybe this has some saying. They've also used the idea that when you look at degradation of cultural similarity, it tends to degrade much more when you go up in latitude than when you go up in longitude. So those are the two tests that are available. We're starting to look at that idea in a much more ecologically oriented way, and we're starting to see that things like the wheel and languages have the same patterns. Long answer to a very simple question, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.